I was really fascinated with how things work. Why do they work? Incessantly. To the point that the first nickname I ever remember having was 20 Questions by my good friend Pete. And when I see a slide, which I know, you guys are here for AI, and I'm putting up how much it fails as an opener. Good opener, huh? I think it is because there's two things that I want to make sure we do at the very onset here, which is start asking the right questions and make sure everybody in this room knows and understands it's okay that it's not successful in what you're doing, because most people aren't. So all of the stories we hear, the excitement is sort of awesome, but grounded in here's the reality. And there are two main reasons for why the failure rate is where they're at. I happen to think that folks coming from a social work background like myself have a leg up on understanding it because it actually has more to do with systems than it has to do with technology. And that's what we're going to begin to talk about a little bit today. At the top, the two major things, whether you read McKinsey or I don't care who you read or whatever journal, it's all going to come down to two different things. Your data is simply information. What you can do, or how you can evaluate data in and of itself is it good data or is it bad data, right? Is it clean or is it dirty? Do you trust it or you don't trust it? When I look at that spreadsheet, do I go, yeah, no, no thank you? Do I know that the numbers that I'm looking at took 3 different people looking at 4 other reports to average a number to put it on there? If those are all the things that I'm thinking, then my data as information, probably not great. Probably not what you want to start running AI on. If you're already suspicious, don't start using it to build other theories off of. And that's what people are doing. They don't know their data well enough in a rush to try to use AI, but they don't really take the time to say, guys, if we're all sitting here going, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't start, but there's a rush to get started. So that's number one, why things fail. But also remember, and this will tie in later, data is just simply information until value is assigned to it. Value can only be assigned to it when that knowledge or understanding or context is agreed upon. Sometimes we call that a theory of change, whatever that applied knowledge is. So your data has to make sense in the context of the world in which you live, and you need to understand how it is a reflection of the system of which it comes from. We'll talk about it in a little bit later. It all has to do with quality. Sometimes in human services, because quality sounds like a manufacturing term, we like to use the word impact. But the reality is you can't really have low quality, high impact. They're synonymous with each other. They're just words that we use because when we talk about people versus automobiles, we use different words because it makes ourselves feel better. But the reality is systems are systems. They work just the same. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Where did my clicker go? There it is. When I was about 10, growing up in Western Michigan, if any of you aren't familiar with that, that's on the other side of the lake in an area called Holland, Michigan, where if you're not Dutch, you're not much. And that's where I grew up. And there were many stories that I heard from my grandfather of, you know where copper wire came from, right? It's 2 Dutch guys fighting over a penny. And so we were very ingrained in this very, very Protestant, very work ethic driven world, and we lived there. And it was very religious. And so for excitement at 10 years old, if we had done really well and things were going well, the family TV would be turned on. And at that time, some of you are old enough to remember, there was a show, and Michael Landon was in it, and it was about miracles. Highway to Heaven, right? Anybody remember? You're old enough? So because this was a really wonderful Wednesday and all things had gone well, the TV was on, and I remember this episode, and they're walking through a park, and they're looking up at the sky, and at this point in my life, I was really trying to figure out, I get the world where I'm in. I was adopted, so I knew where I was from, but I didn't know what I was of, and all I had heard was I was really lucky to be in this place, but I didn't understand how it fit into the rest of the world, and so many messages were being contradictory, and then all of a sudden, this show comes on. And the moral of the story was that essentially we got into the idea that one person can affect. And remember, this is pre-butterfly effect. This is pre-networks. We hadn't even started thinking about that stuff. I mean, maybe at IBM they were talking about networks, but not the rest of us. And so the idea is that when I do something, it affects your life, but your life affects others. And it's all a part of a system, and it trickles. And you have to really know and understand, when I push on this one thing, what does it do downstream? How often do you hear, as Travis said, I have this really bad pain point, and I'm going to alleviate it with AI? Cool. But do you know why? Do you know why the pain point exists? Maybe we should focus on that instead of the AI of maybe this is something a part of our system that we need to change rather than using AI. And that's where a lot of those intersections came in. And so at 10, I began wrestling with this, and it sort of opened my eyes to, oh my goodness, it is bigger. The world is bigger. Our relationships are bigger. Now at 10, I didn't know what the hell that meant or how to apply it, but things started to open up. About 10 years later, I started social work school. And that was the first time that I was exposed to Jane and began learning. And if we look at the lifespan, this is 1860 to 1931. So anytime we get all excited about, oh my God, it's AI, it's innovation, my general response to that, because I spent a lot of years in school, is I'm pretty sure this has happened before. Maybe we should go back and check history. Maybe there's something that we can learn from the past. And what we do know, and what we did learn, and what Jane was talking about then, if we remember, is she was a young lady from a fairly affluent family of northern Chicago who had the means and decided, as she was looking at what was going on not too far from here on the South Loop, right over where UIC is now, and saying, what are we doing? We've got all of these immigrant folks who are living in really bad conditions. What are we doing about it? We keep looking as an American society, and remember at that time, you've got Ford building the Model T in manufacturing, and this theory was if I create 84 steps, if you just follow those, I can not have to worry about the idiot humans that keep screwing stuff up if they just follow instructions. And so it was very much a disposable rather than Jane saying, no, maybe everybody is everything. And maybe the idea is that there is a system and a process. So she went overseas to the very first settlement house in London, came home and built her own. But what she learned and what we learned from her and what we know is that she from the very beginning understood that the process was more important than the outcome. The way we do things is more important than the quality that it produces. And only if we understand the way that we do things can we look at quality. It's like pretty insightful for a social worker. And she also taught us that this push for individualism, right? Think about the early 1900s and all of that was going on, actually was causing the opposite of what we wanted. It wasn't making things more inclusive by being and celebrating our individuality. It was becoming more exclusive. And in the world that she was living and working, what she was, which this is where I was as a social work student who went to social work because I didn't entirely enjoy math, was really disappointed because she was the first person back then to say, those are all great things, but unless we put numbers with it, who cares? And so she was the first person that ever started mapping and collecting data because she wanted to be able to argue against the theory that it was the immigrants' fault and they were just dirty people and that's why they had high infant mortality rates. Rather than, with data we learned that, shockingly, if you don't have a disposal system like sanitation or garbage trucks, things are bad for people. So as soon as they mapped it, implemented it, they started to see. And that's what ultimately ended up leading to her winning a Nobel Peace Prize. But she was the very first one. And look at the years that happened, and we're still trying to do it today. Right? We're going to have Lewis from the city of Chicago talking about Chicago's data journey. And by journey, we mean we're not there yet. She started doing this, look when. So as much as I want to get excited about technology, I am. There's still an underlying thing that we're not doing a very good job of understanding. And without those two working together, we're going to have a problem. Shortly After that, these women are all women that studied under her. Take a look at what those theories and what actually applied, and look at what still is in our lives today. So some of those same ladies that started in Hull House are the originators of minimum wage. They are the originators of Social Security as we know it today, all based off of the same premise that everything is everything, and you have to pay attention to all of it, and we all have a stake. About 10 years after that, I was in more schooling and learned about Charles Deming. And this was the time where now I went from that qualitative social worker, I get it, I understand it, it matches the feelings that I had and I understood and I can put words around it, to that's all cool, but if we can't measure it, what are we going to do about it? And so if anybody's familiar with his story, this is, imagine post-World War II, everybody's coming home, manufacturing is starting to ramp up again, and what happened in the United States is we chose to take the course of quantity over quality. And if you remember at those times, American-made goods did not have a great connotation. And his theory was, well, that's because you're doing an inspection after the work has already been done instead of reflection, which is knowing and understanding the system by which these things are being produced. And that is actually how you create the most influence in quality. That's all he cared about, was the quality. He was driven out of this country because he was a lunatic. And he was sent to Japan. And do you remember what happened to Japanese car makers during that time? Who won? It crushed us. And it was simply because they took a different approach to how and what is produced by the system, and they embraced the system in knowing that no matter what it was the most important thing. And so these are a few of the things that we learned from him. And these aren't shocking. A system must have an aim. If you don't know what the point is, don't do it. Or sit down and figure out what it is. Sometimes we call that mission vision in human service organizations. It all gets to the same thing. If you don't know what you're doing, and or if you've been doing the same thing for 20 years and nobody's had the ability to raise their hand and say, should we be doing this? Should we continue doing this? Do that first. Next. If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. Not the easiest thing to hear, because I can guarantee you if you go back to your organizations and you're sitting there, there's lots of conversations that people have about the stuff that you do and it ain't written down. So don't expect to ever have any quality of it, because if you can't collectively write it down, then you can't collectively say that we know what we're doing. The last quote is really tied back to the first one, which is, big fan of data, but if you don't know what it is, it really doesn't matter. So I stole a little bit from him and put that up front. This is what's called the Deming sort of holy trilogy. These are the things that when you leave here, I hope you hold on to, because the first one of, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing, leads right into these. I assume the others that people know what their aim is and what their purpose is, I hope. But these are where really the rubber meets the road. His belief, his assertion was that every system produces the results that it is uniquely designed to do. Do you notice that he says there's no value judgment? Doesn't say good or bad or positive or negative or close or far. It just simply is what it is. And if you don't know what the outputs of your system are, you can't very well then begin to think about, does that meet the level of quality that we want? Only then can you look back and say, unless we do something about the system, we can't change the output. Does that make sense? I think we oftentimes rush to judgment about good or bad, which leads to people defending themselves rather than, it is what it is, folks. This isn't about one person, it's about all of us. This is what happens when we all do what we're supposed to do. This is the output. If we want to change it, then we have to change the system, not the people. This part, the bad system, the 94-6, how many times have you heard, oh my God, if we just had smarter, different, faster staff, if they just had different, faster, smarter tools, they would do things. His theory was, and why he was so successful overseas versus here, where we took the approach that I already gave you the 84 steps to build a Model T, what's wrong with you? Versus no, actually the people can only influence 6% of the overall impact of the quality of the system. So no matter if you find the best, smartest, fastest, tallest people to replace the ones you have today, you can only move the needle 6% theoretically on moving towards that quality, which means go back to the drawing board. You're picking the wrong scapegoat. The real problem's the system. So how do you go about going back and looking at the system and figuring out what we do? The biggest Achilles heel that he says is, how many times do you have people raise their hand and say, I have a catastrophe. My problem has now become the biggest, the most important problem ever, and we all turn and say, oh my God, let's solve your problem, without taking the step to first figure out, is that a naturally occurring common problem that is just the nature of the system that we have that's uniquely designed to produce the results, and it is what it is, and we got to live with it? Or, in fact, Carol, is it a catastrophe? And if it is, that's a special case, and we need to address it as such. Which means we need to address it as it is and not indict the system for something it didn't produce because it was a special circumstance that happened for reasons outside of it. And mixing those two is where we get in big trouble and finger pointing, and nothing really moves forward with advancing the system because we're distracted on the rabbit hole that wasn't connected. So if you can hold on to those three things when you leave and you go back, maybe you don't start doing anything about it, but just snicker in the room when you're listening to other stuff and hold those in your head and be like, yeah, okay, I hear you, but it's up a level. So that gets us to knowing and understanding the social work side, the data side. And those are all well and good, but if you can't teach other people about it, then it doesn't matter. So now the teacher in me is going to come out. And we're going to go way, way, way back because we were still talking about the same things then as the same things that we're talking about today. One former is worth 1,000 reformers. Same thing is, do it right the first time. Teach them the right way the first time, and then you don't have to undo 100 things you didn't want to, and it gets out of there. Take the time to onboard people right. Take the time to teach them the processes that you took the time to write down, not just what was in Carol's head. And I'm sorry if anybody's name is Carol. The other side of it is, my grandpa used to say all the time, practice what you preach. Right? The other side is, it's one thing to talk about it, it's a whole other thing to do it. So unless you're willing to commit to do it, stop talking about it because you're just frustrating people. And it's hollow. So if you're going to commit to it, commit to doing it right the first time so that you're not fixing problems that were of your own doing. And if you're going to do it, follow through and do it. Seems reasonable, doesn't it? Seems crazy that this is what we were learning about in the late 1800s, and yet today it feels quite relevant, possibly still the same problem. And that's okay, because I have a suspicion that's part of the human condition, and that's just not going to go away, even with AI. And when we think about AI and one of the greatest challenges that we have right now, people are freaking out, right? It's going to take my job. It's going to, and getting into all of those sorts of questions and worrying. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that we're not reminding ourselves and people that AI is as smart as the human that is telling it what to do. And if you start to rely on it to do the thinking for you, that's not an AI problem, that's a you problem. AI is a tool. It is not going to take your job. And it isn't going to give you value. That is our job to do to other people that we work with in our organizations, to make sure that we provide them the education and the knowledge and the tools so that when they do their work, they feel valued. That's our job. Now, AI is part of doing that, but it doesn't supplant it, and it certainly won't make people happy. It has a greater potential to make people upset than it does happy. But it's our job to make sure that we're teaching people in this time of whether you assign value of the wild, wild west or wherever you want to make this time be, I think it's fun. I like it when there's no rules. Because now I know and you know more about what the underlying guardrails are of there are no rules. There are guardrails, there are things to think about, and there are theories to hold on to. And as long as we hold on to those collectively together, we can make the smartest, best decisions for ourselves and our organizations because it's grounded in a theory, in an understanding, in a knowledge base. So please, as you're sitting and listening today, and part of how we constructed the day is, might be if there's any, it's my own research methodology that's been beaten in my head over years of schooling, of the three-legged stool, or always considering the three different perspectives. There's the qualitative side of all of this. You got to know your people, you got to know your systems, you got to know all of the other stuff that isn't measured, that's squishy like Jell-O, that you can't hold on to, but it is incredibly important and it makes up your system. But it is also not the most important thing because those conversations can get derailed as well, right? When emotions take too much of the stage. It doesn't mean ignore them, it means put them in the right place and balance them. And you can only do that and squeeze that and hold that if you all know and agree on what does quality mean. So when you as your organization are successful, do you know what that means? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And only after you know that, then can you be able to start having the questions around, cool, now that I know what it looks and feels like and we're aligned and we understand where it comes from in this system, what data do we believe reflects that in both a positive and a negative way? So that when we're looking at the data to say whether or not we're being successful or not, we're all aligned on what those numbers mean and where they track back to and why they make me feel good when I go to bed at night. And when we begin to look at where to start with AI, I'm not going to tell you that. You're going to listen to that in a bunch of breakout sessions, different places, and anybody that has the idea to tell you where to start is full of baloney. But what I can tell you is where not to start really easily. Where to start is going to be a collective decision of all of you. And anytime your urge is to solve the thing that's a pain in the ass and we just don't want to do anymore, look upstream. Not a good place to start. That problem started somewhere else. It doesn't change how it affects your daily life, but look upstream. That's the place to start looking in your system, to start making and asking questions of, how does this align with quality? Because down here, it's off the rails. So up here, what are we doing wrong? What do we need to do differently? How do we need to change this? And that is the intersection at which maybe looking at AI and using other tools. But always force yourself to look upstream.